All right, Nick. So I think the best place to start with you is to really just get an overview of kind of who you are and what you're interested in. And from that perspective, I would ask, what is a linguistic anthropologist and what are your core foci as a researcher?
Okay, so that's kind of big question. So for me personally, I guess I got into language young. So growing up in Australia, it's actually quite for certainly then, pretty monolingual in terms of education, that kind of thing. But it's a very diverse society also. So we have a lot of languages spoken here. And I had some contact with people from a lot of countries that were in an English language school that my uncle used to run. And I kind of, when I think back, I feel like that experience of meeting a lot of those people from different parts of the world coming together kind of gave me a sense of wanting to know about those places. And I was into kind of looking at the atlas, and I just look at it and trace kind of borders of countries and these kinds of things. So I kind of got fascinated with the rest of the world in some sense as a kid, and then was able to go and do a kind of backpacking trip out of high school and stuff, visit a lot of countries, and just kind of got into learning languages as yeah, maybe a hobby, something to do while traveling, and I kind of had a bit of an aptitude for it and enjoyed it. And one thing led to another, and I got into that in university, and I discovered linguistics as a field. So I got into it through linguistics, which is kind of pretty diverse field. It has a lot of angles, so there's a kind of psychological angle to it and a more kind of mathematical angle to it, and sociological angle to it. And that's kind of the beauty of it. So I got pretty interested in all of those different angles. But in my training in Australia, it's very much focused on studying languages that haven't been fully described before. So small languages spoken by small communities,
Mm.
Indigenous languages, sort of strong tradition in Australia of studying languages of Aboriginal Australia and the Pacific. Um, so I was trained to do linguistic field work and to go to uh, places away from my home and find out about languages that where not much was previously known. So I specialize in mainland Southeast Asia, and Laos is the country where I've done most of my field work. So I've worked on the national language of Laos, known as Lao, and also uh, minority languages there. And so, to your question about what's a linguistic anthropologist, when you do field work, so there's different kinds of linguists. So some linguists might study, their own language and kind of work in an armchair, or they might, um, do kind of computational linguistics and use the computer. The different kinds of approaches. But this type of linguistics requires you to go and become embedded in a community that is not, your home community. So it's often culturally very different from where you're from. And if you're trying to operate in that kind of a setting, do research in that kind of a setting, you're kind of immediately engaging with issues around sociological questions and anthropological questions. You're trying dealing with cultural difference. You're dealing with different social organization, not just questions of kind of nouns and verbs and
Right.
prepositions. So there's a very kind of natural sense in which you get, swept up into anthropological questions, and that's what happened to me. And I think many of my colleagues and mentors and so forth have had the same experience. So there is this field of anthropology called linguistic anthropology, and in fact, if you look at anthropology as a tradition, there's something called the four fields approach to anthropology. So one of those fields is linguistics, in that kind of traditional way of thinking about anthropology. There's a kind of history of science question here that we won't get into, but essentially that's the answer. So a linguistic anthropologist. I mean, my story is just one way in
Mm-hmm.
which you can get into linguistic anthropology, but essentially what it means is that you're studying and analyzing language in such a way that you're learning from or learning about culture and social organization. What are the constraints on what kinds of cultures and societies we can have? What are the possibilities for what kinds of cultures and societies we can have? And language is really at the center of social life. So I think linguistic anthropologists have an important role.
Yeah. For you learning those other languages, people often talk about the fact that learning a second language kind of gives you this almost superpower, right? It gives you this almost separation between the thought that you're wanting to express and the reference or the lasso on reality that you throw to go find it, right? it,
Yeah.
it kind of empowers you with this ability to see language and thought in a different way. For you personally, have you had an experience like that as you learn these new languages, and is that something that you can relate to or have thought about?
Oh, absolutely. So, multilingualism, I mentioned my own kind of childhood in a monolingual setting. That's
Mm-hmm.
pretty unusual around the world. So most people in the world and through history are multilingual, and they're speaking, you know, one or maybe more languages in their kind of close home contexts, other languages from kind of neighboring groups, maybe more languages from further afield. So it's quite the standard to speak two or three or four languages. Um, and so in that sense, it's kind of nothing unusual about that capacity. But it certainly does have the properties that you mentioned, I think. So there's a sense of empowerment with each language that you learn. It's a classic theme in linguistic anthropology that you learn a language, you kind of learn a new world, you learn a new
Mm-hmm.
sort of way of seeing things. And you know, in this book that I published in 2022, Language versus Reality, there's a lot of kind of exploration there about how actually our kind of grasp on reality is very fragmentary. It's very partial. So, there is a very, very complex reality around us. It's really shrunk down. Our access to it is really shrunk down by essentially our bodies and how we perceive the world. So we can only see a certain subset of the spectrum. We can only hear a certain subset of the kind of frequency range. So we're getting a subset just through our perception. And then languages are kind of cutting that down pretty radically once again. So, when you're studying language, what you're really doing is looking at how different cultural histories have kind of whittled and whittled and whittled down reality in some way to kind of focus on or kind of develop uh, ideas around kind of what are the things that we encounter and how do we kind of orient to them. So the flip side of what you're asking about, whether languages empower you, is that in the first place, they kind of very, very much reduce what you're able to kind of see, pay attention to. Now, I don't mean that in a kind of, it's not like a straitjacket. You can
Right.
always kind of go beyond it. You can focus on things that your attention wasn't drawn to. But, we're sort of constrained by the fact that kind of time is rolling on and we only have so much time to think and act. So we're generally kind of reaching for the ideas and the categories and the expressions that we most frequently use. So there's a lot of habit, if you like, in the way that we use language for kind of social purposes. So every time you learn a new language, then it's opening up what seems like a whole world, but at the same time, the flip side of that is it's another very thin slice
Mm-hmm.
of the world, but it does kind of multiply your perspectives, your potential perspectives. And so I think that's something that's really important is, you sometimes hear about viewpoint diversity as a really important force in, in thinking well and kind of getting access to different ways of thinking and choosing between, different decisions and solutions you might be thinking about. So language diversity gives you some of that. So it gives you a sense of viewpoint diversity, different ways of conceptualizing the kinds of things you see. So a lot of linguistic analysis is really about, well, what kinds of ways do languages frame things in the world? You know,
Yeah.
how does language present phenomena in different kinds of ways? So you see that across languages, but you also see it within a language. Any language gives you many different ways of describing the same thing, and that is something that we tap into. It's kind of, I don't know, I tend to describe it as strategic. So
Mm-hmm.
um, you know, it gives you ways not only of seeing the world, and I think this is something that in these kinds of discussions we often talk about how our language makes you see the world in a different way,
Yeah.
and more I kind of resist that framing, because that framing very much sees language as being a link between people and the world that they're sort of perceiving or acting in, right?
Yeah.
Um, but it's primarily not that. It's primarily a coordination device between people. So what you're primarily doing is not, you know, choosing to see the world in a certain way. What you're primarily doing with a linguistic choice is you're choosing to present the world to someone else in a certain way. So the language is giving you a framing, it's giving you a kind of a model of what you want to talk about that highlights certain things and, you know, backgrounds certain things, selects certain things, and makes certain things invisible. Um, and so it's really more of an interactional kind of uh, power that language has, rather than a power to kind of make you think a certain way.
Yeah,
And
maybe we can dig into that a bit more with the subtitle of your book there, why it's bad for scientists and good for lawyers. Can you say more a little bit about the book and its overview, and how this maybe thin slice of reality that we have makes it hard for scientists to really describe reality in its fullness, but maybe works really well, as you're pointing out, for lawyers who are kind of creating the social norms and cooperation between people?
sure. So, you know, that subtitle was a kind of last minute addition in a way. You know, kind of borrowing in a way some of that terminology around, you know, the idea that from kind of social psychology sometimes talks in this way about how, you know, we don't have an inner scientist so much as an inner lawyer, and which is a way of saying that, you know, human beings seem to be more oriented to influence, persuasion, justification than we are to, you know, arriving at the facts. And
Yeah.
that's often because, you know, well, it's a bit paradoxical. So of course the facts are crucial for us. Otherwise, you know, we court disaster. We don't want to
Mm-hmm.
walk around with false beliefs about what's, you know, around the next corner and things like that. But language is not a perceptual apparatus. You know, we have a body to perceive the world. Language is a coordinative tool, so it's a tool for coordinating with others. It wouldn't exist if it didn't have that function. I mean, there are of course secondary functions that we can use for thought and so forth, and it's really changed uh, humans. The fact that we have language, but primarily language exists as a coordinative tool. And so that is what I'm trying to capture with that idea of the difference between kind of what a scientist needs language for and what a lawyer needs language for. So, what is a lawyer doing? A lawyer is trying to persuade, trying to convince. And I guess the key thing about a lawyer is that they come into their job on a particular occasion. I mean, at the very beginning of the process, that of course, and at any time, they're interested in the facts. But at a certain point, they take a position, which is the position in the interest of their client, and they seek to find every way of defending that position that they can. And so that, what do? Well, they rely very heavily on, um, you know, on language, so on linguistic choices. So I have some description of a lot of examples actually in the book, but some of them are from legal proceedings as it happens. So in one of the examples, it's a rape trial, and you know there is a well-known trope around these kinds of trials where you know a woman has been attacked, has been assaulted, and after the fact, there is an argument around, you know, not just what happened, but why and how. So one of these tropes is that the woman is, you know, the lawyer who's defending the accused then tries to frame the woman's behavior as somehow inviting that action, inviting that behavior, and so forth. So there's all of this kind of framing around consent and that kind of thing. So I report a study that was done around the kind of courtroom discourse where the lawyer is saying things like he saying to the woman who was assaulted about the man's behavior that evening before the incident, he sat with you, and the woman replies saying he sat at our table. So this is an example where it seems like a very subtle difference, but he sat with you. If you accept that way of framing it, it's saying, you know, he was part of your group. You were somehow, you know, associated with him already. It's made some social commitments to this person. Whereas when she says he sat at our table, you see it's just focusing now on the spatial location. He was at the table, but it's very kind of, you know, artful in a way of reframing it to say that, you know, I deny those implications of kind of association, sharing within the same group and so on. So there's a number of other examples in that particular case, but this would be one case where there probably isn't a scientific way to determine that one of those descriptions is better than the other or more accurate than the other, right? He sat with us versus he sat at our table. And that's because the real task of this linguistic choice is to persuade and convince people to come to a certain agreement about the reality. And so, okay, that's the lawyer's task in a way, that they love language because it kind of gives them all this kind of wiggle room, you know. With scientists, it's tough because they're kind of like scouts who I mean, ideally, what you're trying to do is not argue for a certain idea to be true, but to just find out what is true. Now, I know that's an ideal because if you're involved in science at all, you know that people get very attached to their beliefs and their theories and they try to defend them tooth and nail. And there's a whole discussion we could have around that. But if we just stick to the ideal of what science is supposed to be about, you know, imagine that you really are a scout in the military sense, that you're part of a group who wants to take a military action, and you've got to go out and actually discover where are the enemy troops and where are the vulnerabilities and what kinds of, you know, weapons or vehicles they have or whatever you need to know. Well, you want to come back with accurate information, right? It's not that you want to come back and persuade your fellow soldiers of something that you know not to be true or that you're not sure about. You want reliable, accurate information. And so that's essentially what a scientist is supposed to be doing. If you're designing a medicine or if, you know, some kind of treatment or some kind of, you know, whatever scientists do, a manufacturing kind of process or something, you want it to work. You want bridges to stay up when cars drive over them and all the rest of it. So for them, it's not really about trying to frame reality and convince people. It's trying to cut through all of that,
right,
kind of, and get to the bottom of it. Because of course, language, the reality exists independent of the way we talk about it. You know, if a bridge falls down, doesn't matter what language you're speaking, you're going to fall down with it.
Would you say that it's fair to represent this in a sense that as evolving creatures, it would be almost pointless for us to vocalize the maps and the models of the world to ourselves because we already have them, you know, as this we already have that kind of science happening in our mind as we perceive reality, and therefore the main reason that language might come into being maybe the sense of Robin, how Robin Dunbar might say, like the gossip hypothesis, is because we actually want to use these models and maps and give them to other people. We want to somehow use them in the social domain. So in a way, language really has its value as a way to externalize our internal world, because otherwise it would be pointless to say something out loud. Is that kind of fair? Are you sympathetic to that interpretation?
Yeah, close, half half. So I very much
Yeah.
agree with you about. I mean, I think Dunbar is essentially right that that language is primarily. I mean, the evidence shows that language is what we do with it is we coordinate with each other socially. Um, where I think what you just said, I would turn it around actually, because you
Please.
said, we externalize this sort of our internal world using language. I think it's really the other way around, that language develops a kind of an external set of frames of reference for social kind of coordination.
Mm,
Uh, and we receive that as children, we receive that from a history of other people developing those coordination devices. So every word is a coordination device. It's something we use to coordinate with others and in ways that are relevant to the cultural setting we're in and so forth. So that doesn't come from internally for us as individuals. We receive and
right.
we have to learn. When I say receive, I mean, we have to learn it, and we learn it in an active sense. We kind of construct an understanding of our language, but it comes from this kind of history of public kind of coordination. So what's encoded in the language is actually uh, created by a history of social interaction in a cultural setting. So it's the sort of cultural version of what Richard Dawkins calls the genetic book of the dead. It's like the kind of
Mm,
linguistic book of the dead. Every language is a kind of linguistic book of the dead because it's created by all of these past actions of other people. So you're not really externalizing something from your own head when you're using a language. It's the other way around. I feel if you are using a language to think, which of course we often do, what you're really doing is taking on that set of tools that you've acquired or that you've inherited, and you're using that to kind of reason and so forth. Now,
yeah.
of course, we think in non-linguistic ways, we're capable of doing that. Um, but I think it's something important. Also, another thing I wanted to say about your question is that um, a lot of our kind of, I don't know, you mentioned something like scientific, inner scientist kind of thinking around
Mm,
reality is not really conscious. It's not something that we kind of overtly reason around. So we have all of these instincts about, for example, just the physical world. In the room around us, something falls, we avoid it. Something's going to drop, we can just grab it. And lots of other ways of kind of heeding our environment, and not necessarily, we don't stop and reason about it. We kind of, or if there is some kind of reasoning, it's very far below the surface. Um, so there is something important in here around the difference between kind of unconscious, reactive, intuitive kind of behavior and kind of reasoning or deliberate behavior. And
yeah.
the second thing is much more likely to involve linguistic categories and categories that we communicate about, because communication is much more deliberate in that sense. At the same time, I think there is some kind of leakage, and that's between those two levels. So, that's an open question. A lot of the linguistic research on kind of cultural effects on language and thought is really about seeing if there is that connection. So, is it the case that when you acquire a language that's specific to a certain culture, does that then somehow affect this lower level experience of the world?
Yeah. How I guess closely integrated would you say those two things are in terms of, let's say, non-instinctual higher order, like cognitive thinking and language? And for instance, I'm thinking of like John Vervaeke. He did work on the meaning crisis, cognitive neuroscientist at Toronto. He talks about one of the things that has happened over the course of history is that we've had what he calls psychotechnologies, things like grammar and the written word, and that these things actually are almost like software upgrades for the hardware of our brain, because by putting language in this unified rule-based form, it really streamlines our capacity to think about things. We kind of unlock this new level of fluidity for our thoughts. And one thing I often think about with time that you kind of alluded to there is the temporal aspect, right? The almost like the ability to tell a story in a sense feels like it gives us more power to have past, present, and future, more so than if we didn't have language. So this is a big way to really ask, I guess, how much of our cognitive sophistication is tied to our linguistic sophistication.
Well, I certainly agree that language is a cognitive technology but equally a social technology. So I always, I've already said, I think a couple of times today that, often these discussions are about, what does language do to the mind? And we're very often bracketing out, what does it do to social relations? And that's sort of equally important because our world is as much a social world as it is some other kind of world. It's very hard to kind of quantify the question that you're asking. So I think you asked something like, to what extent is, language reaching into sort of more fundamental cognitive processes? And, I really have no way of answering that. Is it 5%? Is it 95%? How would we know? I think, so one of the things I review in the book is some of the work that's really tried to show that our judgments around things like perception and so forth are affected by the language that we speak, and I think there's established work that shows that. But you can question that in a way. So John McWhorter, for example, a linguist from Columbia, he wrote a book about basically against this idea of linguistic relativity, and he wasn't really saying that the data were false or the findings were wrong. He was saying it's just not that significant. It's like, okay, there's this few small kind of effects, and so what? So all he's really saying is, in answer to your question, yeah, there's some effects, but they're just very minor and they're small. And other people, I think Steven Pinker would be another example of someone who's kind of saying that. And I'm sympathetic to that because I think there's plenty of things in our thinking that aren't affected by language. But on the other hand, I'm happy to frame the effects as being a lot more important, or take more seriously the idea that language can kind of affect, let's say, lower level thinking. But when we talk about lower level kind of cognition, I think it's not clear always what we mean, or there's so many different things that we could be referring to. So sometimes it's about just sort of perception at a very sort of basic level, and people taking literally the idea that you kind of see the world differently. And that's certainly there in some of the older kind of classic work in this area by authors like Sapir and Whorf.
Yeah.
But in the Language versus Reality book that we're talking about, I kind of go back to some of those original ideas that Whorf, or examples that Whorf is giving. And I think when you revisit them, so he has these famous examples from, so Whorf was a linguistic anthropologist or anthropological linguist, however you want to call it. And he is a famous proponent, perhaps the most famous proponent of this linguistic relativity hypothesis, the idea that the language you speak affects the way you think and see the world. And his famous examples were from his time as a fire insurance guy. And so basically he would go to these places where a fire had happened, like in a factory or something, and they'd made an insurance claim, and he would have to go and just assess like who was at fault. And he records these examples where people said, oh, well, there's this stuff in the corner of the workshop and it's called spun limestone. And, it's kind of stone. Like who thought that it would go on fire? And, so I wasn't taking care about it, and it blew up, it sort of combusted, and then the workshop burnt down. So this is one of these examples where he said, look at the word for this object. It's called spun limestone. And it's linguistically, that is a kind of stone. If you just don't know what the object is, you just analyze the name of it. And it's a very sort of superficial, simple example, but it's the kind of thing that he saw again and again, that people were somehow being led to make a certain decision based on the way the world was being presented to them through the language. So I don't think those examples are really give you any clear evidence that the person who's, looking at this substance sees it differently in some sense. That I don't actually think that's really the point. I think the point is, how do you reason about it, and what action do you take such that the linguistic framing of that, of whatever is at hand plays a role in making you decide to go this way or that way with the behavior that you're carrying out. So that's where I think, the relativity effects are more important.
Yeah, maybe we can kind of combine these two worlds then in a way to kind of bring in the importance of language's constraints and that relativity with the social world. So, if we take like Wittgenstein's idea, the limits of my language or the limits of my world, earlier you were talking about our socialization, and I guess that makes me think about, in a sense, when we're given those words, kind of in the case of the limestone, right? If our super malleable brain is taking these words as the definitions of reality, then in a sense we're immediately, as we're moving through the world, it does feel like in some ways our social perception of what is possible, our perception of what is possible in the social world, is very much constrained by the words that we were given, right? Especially if it's a more strict kind of belief system that comes with their words, like a religion or political philosophy or something like that. So do you think it's at least fair to say that there is some level of relativity or constraint that comes from language in terms of how we operate in the social domain?
Absolutely. Yeah. I think there is. I think the effects are there, and I think there's lots of strong arguments. You just don't want to kind of misinterpret them. So I don't think any linguistic person who believes that linguistic relativity is real is ever saying that, you're imprisoned by your language, or that you're incapable of seeing things in another way or whatever. Of course we are. We're able to learn other languages. We're able to, and in fact, when we do learn other languages, going back to your earlier comments, we often report that, we see something differently than we did before. So, I think that the effects of language are very clearly there. Again, I would want to say that the mechanism is not one where, it sort of reaches into your brain and makes you believe you're in a different universe. I think that, so one of the things I've begun to think more about in recent years is this kind of idea of, sometimes referred to as nudge theory. It's sometimes referred to as choice architecture. If you look at literature on design, whether it's a design of kind of online forms that you fill in, or apps, or whether it's design of a house or a cafeteria, a boat or an emergency device or whatever, there's a recognition that people who are trying to navigate their world are, under certain limitations. So they don't have a lot of time. They're multitasking, doing other things. They've got kind of inherent cognitive limitations. So the way you design something, as I said, like an app or whatever, will tend to direct people towards a certain action as opposed to another certain action. So this is very often exploited in what people in this field sometimes call dark patterns. So, you go online, you got this app, and it gives you a choice, and it says, do you want to upgrade to the paid subscription or whatever? You're using the free service. Do you want to upgrade? It's a giant green button that says, yes, please. And then down right in the bottom, there's a very gray letters, no button, just a bit of gray wordage saying, no, thanks, proceed to the app or whatever. So that's like a very heavy-handed kind of version of this choice architecture, but it's basically, I think it's a good metaphor for a lot of what language is doing. It's kind of giving you like your language gives you all these big green buttons, right? That, here's the obvious answer. And it's not because it's a better answer or it's more suitable for your current needs or anything like that. It's just bigger and more obvious, and it's the one we usually press. Now, in the case of the app with the yes please button, it's there's a nefarious kind of motivation behind it. Someone has actually designed that in order to manipulate you. Now, with languages, I said earlier that, the language, let's say in this case, we're talking English. So the English language has not been designed by any individual person. It's emerged from this history of kind of events where people have used the language for a certain kind of understanding. And it's a massive, an enormous chain of events that has led us to have the set of categories that we have. So there's a whole set of kind of buttons and so on that we tend to find easier to press and other ones that are kind of harder to press. Now, what's important here, though, is that when you get presented with a piece of a designed piece of language, so instead of thinking about an app, think about a sentence that someone's just said to you, and then you have to decide what to think or what to do next. That sentence has not been designed by people in the past. The pieces of it have, but the sentence has been designed by the person in front of you who's saying it. So you get these certain parts of the language are not your choice. You're accepting or receiving an architecture from, your ancestors in some sense. But within that, then you become a designer yourself in such a way that then, creates a big green button and a sort of a dark gray kind of little bit of wording for the person who you're talking to. So what it means is that, so with choice architecture, the way that those researchers often talk about it, nudge theories, they're saying, we're not manipulating people. You can pick anything you want, So there's often nudge theorists who talk about things like public health measures, like how to get people to pick more healthy food at the cafeteria, right? So you actually physically design the place in such a way that they encounter all the healthy foods in the first passageway, and then the unhealthy foods are at the end. So they've filled up their plate. They don't have much space. That would be one way to do it. It's all about kind of prominence, foregrounding, and so on. But the key thing there is that in the end, they're saying you still are free. You have the choice. You can eat, purely bad food if that's what you want to do. We're just trying to nudge you in a good direction. And I think, language works very much like that. And I like that way of thinking about it because it foregrounds the idea that we're influencing each other using language, and it backgrounds the idea that language is just this kind of mediator between us as cognitive agents and the world. And that's usually how this stuff is talked about. But I think what's really important is that it's actually much more about interpersonal influence, which has this crucial cognitive component. It works through exploiting cognition, but its fundamental kind of purpose is social coordination.
Yeah, I really enjoy that framing. It makes me wonder a little bit. What are your thoughts on something like memetics and the evolution of language? Is there something to be said for this idea that the language that is best at foregrounding the green button or helping someone be persuasive is language that tends to persist into the future and becomes adopted by the mainstream? Or do you think this idea of memetics maybe isn't as valuable in this sense?
I think it's valuable, but I think there's a danger with that way of talking that just kind of suggests pure imitation. And I don't think that it's pure imitation. Certainly in language, there is imitation. So there are many different motivations for saying the things that we say. So I've been talking about essentially actions that are designed out of language. So you try to get someone to come to a decision. You try to, let's say, threaten someone or promise something to someone. You're kind of trying to get a reaction there through the thing that you're saying. There's also these other functions which are, at the same time, you might be trying to project something about who you are. So you might speak in a certain accent. You might use a certain phrase, not because it helps to foreground some bit of information about the scene, but it tells the other person something about you as a person. So I'm cool, or I'm a certain age, or I'm being super informal. We might use swearing, or we might use slang or whatever. Those things are on a kind of another level. So those second things are very much susceptible to imitation, in the sense that, I want to be like these people, so I'm going to speak like these people. But that's on a kind of second level. That's a level of self-presentation in some sense. So there's always the kind of, with language, there's always kind of these two tracks in some sense, well, multiple tracks. But among those multiple tracks, there is sort of the meaning I'm trying to convey about the world or some situation. And then there's the meaning I'm trying to convey about myself and who I am. So imitation is important for both, for a number of these things. But imitation is different from learning and from experience, right? So you might use a word that I didn't understand that well, or articulate a concept in a way that I really like, and I might go look up that word or write down that way of framing it and then use it later. You could look at that and say, okay, I'm imitating. But that's different from just sort of parroting in some sense. What I'm doing is I'm seeing a strategy that you've used, I'm understanding the outcome of it. And so it's really not just copying, it's actually learning, right? So then you're applying what you've learned. So we're constantly learning. And in that sense, if that's what you mean by kind of mimetic, then sure. I just think I want to distinguish that from kind of just superficial imitation, which I think is something is sometimes more often. I mean, I don't really know a lot about that area of kind of mimetics in that sense, but the flavor I get from it when people tend to talk about it is that it's kind of superficial imitation. Also, there's a kind of another danger is to kind of take a very simplistic behaviorist kind of understanding of what you said, where you just sort of you have this stimulus response reinforcement without any mediating kind of rationalization. And I think what's really important is that, yes, if we do. So coming back to what you were asking, yes, when we see a strategy through language that works well, and that is, for example, easy to use, has good effects, we're going to use it again, and people are going to use it more. And this is a tendency where certain things become more and more frequent, and then that feeds more of that frequency later. And languages are structured very much like this, and so that depends on certain sets of functions being really frequent. So take, for example, how do we ask people to pass things to us around the breakfast table? So a lot of our life is just domestic. We're at home. We need someone to pass the salt. We need someone to pass a knife in the kitchen or whatever. So we have these really reliable techniques for how we do that. We say, could you pass the salt? And other kinds of ways of doing that. So we tend to stick to fairly reliable devices for coordination. So those would be good examples of kind of how language serves as a coordination device. And the ones that have worked before, we'll use them again. Not because we're imitating per se, but just because we've got a goal, we want to achieve that goal with the least amount of effort and potential kind of turbulence. So you go for the thing that usually works in that situation. Boom, you get the effect, move ahead.
Is this, I don't want to say necessarily standardization, but let's say coalescing towards some kind of average or like frequent use of language? Is this what kind of makes things like large language models and AI so capable of I guess just acting like humans, of approximating language, really? I guess in general, could you just say more maybe about how you feel about AI and large language models as well?
Yeah, I think you're probably right that it's a sort of a very strong yes and no, I think, in this case. So I think, yes, in that frequency will get you a long way. So, the way that we generally understand how large language models work is that they're not just it's not frequency is not the right word to be accurate. It's more probability.
Mm-hmm.
The frequency is closely related to probability. So, I guess probability is some kind of a measure of frequency given a context. So, humans are smart and we can track lots of different things at the same time. So, going back to what we were just discussing, it's certainly important for us to have a sense of what is the usual, most frequent way of saying something. So this is an important principle that, was discovered quite a while ago, often attributed to the philosopher Grice, who, said, look, when people say things, among the various things he said is that, you just try to say the thing in the way that everyone normally says it. Stick to the standard way of speaking, because if you don't, so an example might be something like, he started the car, started the car. It's just a regular way of saying that he turned the car ignition on, I suppose. But if you say instead, he turned the key and then the ignition came on, or something like he got the car to start, those are less frequent ways of describing this very common event. And so his argument was when a speaker chooses a less frequent, less usual way of speaking, they're going to be implying something that means it's not a usual situation. So maybe the person was having trouble starting the car, and then you might say, well, he got it to start. Maybe it was too cold or what have you. So I'm talking about that because there's something very fundamental about our ability to track as users of language, what are the usual ways of speaking and what are the kind of departures from that. So when people speak in an unexpected way, then our sort of, slow thinking kicks in, our sort of system 2 thinking kicks in, and we think, well, why are they putting it in that kind of unusual way? So we are sensitive to frequency effects. We're sensitive to probabilities. So that's the yes part. The no part is that we then, we have minds and we have, these models where we're trying to think about how what people say makes sense in terms of their goals, their beliefs. There's a sort of a whole intuitive psychology that we apply when we're trying to interpret how people talk. And so we're combining, I think it's clear that humans are combining, kind of applying our cognition and our minds to interpretation together with just sort of brute facts about what we know about our language, like what are the relative frequencies of words and so on. So, with AI or large language models specifically, it's very complicated what goes on under the hood, and that's not my field. But in terms of how they create what they create, one piece of it that plays an important role is this sense of what's most likely to occur next in a given kind of context. So it produces, given the amount of data that they're fed on, produces incredible outputs that seem very natural to us and make a lot of sense. And they do have these limitations and these problems, but they're obviously incredibly impressive. You asked me, what do I think kind of generally? Well, it's funny because I don't really think anything. I mean, they are what they are. I don't think that they're sort of inherently good or bad. I think that they're definitely changing how they will change how we kind of consume information, because more and more, I think it's a little bit easier to see in the visual domain. So more and more visual images can be created by AI. And I mean, today, I think there's a lot of images that look like a photograph that I see online that are AI, and I don't even realize it. But a lot of them, you can see, and I don't think they're hiding that fact. I walked down the street the other day in Sydney and walked past a Japanese restaurant, noodle restaurant, and the big signs, nice pictures of people eating noodles, and this lady had, 6 fingers, and I thought, look at that. It's that, they're using AI to do. They don't have to get models to come and do photo shoots and stuff anymore.
Right.
Um, so it's changing everything, but I think what it's going to change is something about the kind of our epistemic vigilance, our epistemic kind of stance to what we hear and see. And I think it's just going to change the baseline for us that more and more we're going to see images, and the default is going to be, I don't know if this is real or not. I feel for myself anyway, it's really beginning to kind of, change in that way. But it won't change with human beings that we're standing across from. We're not going to be going, oh, is this a real person or not?
Right.
Whereas that I think is really where we're facing a kind of tipping point right now, where images people see online that nobody will assume that it's real until they somehow have a good kind of confirmation of that, which is right, which is as it should be, right? So I feel like it's actually that would be a good outcome. Because probably it's lagging far behind. That would have been a good stance to have already for a few decades.
Right.
It is, well, I'm just not going to believe this thing that I'm reading online or even in newspapers until I really have to. So, I mean, I sort of gone a little bit off tangent here, but
No, it's good.
I feel like it's important in terms of our sort of epistemic practices around encountering communicative acts. And, language is traditionally very much anchored to real people who we have real relationships with, who are standing in front of us. I mean, that's the ancestral kind of setting in which it was evolved. And now we're grappling with this very, very rapidly changing world, which is not just large language models. It's electronic media, a nanosecond before that, and then writing a nanosecond before that, or printing rather, and then writing. So these are all very recent developments and changing the life of language pretty radically. And I guess those are issues for another whole conversation.
Another one indeed. With that being said, Nick, we are, I think, just a minute or two out from our allotted time. I want to make sure I respect your time in that sense. But do you have any closing thoughts you would like to leave with? Maybe some clarifications or just anything at all that you would like to leave the audience with?
Well, I feel like I've kind of said what I think pretty much about these questions about kind of language and how it relates to reality. And I think if there was one thing I would really emphasize, it would be to reiterate a point I've made a couple of times today, and that is that in the discussions about how language and kind of cultural diversity relate to thought, it's really amazing to me how much this continually gravitates towards the kind of mental experience of the individual. That this is, how do we see the world? It's all about a kind of the relation between an individual agent and the kind of world that they perceive, however we want to put that. But of course, the most dominant world for us really is the social world. That's the first thing, that, society and the kind of cultural world is the world for us, not sort of rocks and trees and things like that, which, they're in our world. But so the social world is really a big piece of it. But not only that, it's not just how we perceive the social world, but it's really seeing language as a coordination device, as a device for acting in the world and for influencing our world, in this case, our social world. So when you see language that way and reframe that kind of, language and thought question that way, you begin to see thought as being much more active, much more agentive, much more relational, which is, I think the right way to think about cognition and thought, particularly if we're trying to think about what's special about, about humans and what we do with our special cognition.
Wonderful. All right, then, Nick, we'll leave it there. Thank you so much for your time, man.
Thanks for having me.